Thanks for everyone for coming. So this is joint work with Eric Posner, and Eric and I have quite different personality types. So I think Eric is probably a personality type much more familiar around these circles. He's like a real sort of Ben Stein, style door technocrat, and he loves to just like get into the details of policy design. And me on the other hand, I was a multicolored hair socialist at the age of 10. I was a Ayn Rand adoring libertarian, founder of the National Canadian Republican Organization, and attendee of the Bush inauguration in 2015. And sort of been trying to reconcile those things ever since. So while I'll get, and I'm looking forward to discussion with Tom on some of the real, what can we use this for and whatever, I first want to try to open your minds a little bit to a different way of conceptualizing our politics, possibly because it'll make space, I think, for better ways of thinking about policy as well. So to do that, I want to take you on a journey of imagination, sort of in the spirit of science fiction, so suspend your disbelief for a little bit, to a city that I'm going to call Marketopia. So Marketopia's defining feature, unlike Zootopia, is not the diverse and adorable mammals who live there, but instead the fact that all the major private property, the land and the houses, the buildings and the airplanes, the intellectual property and the factories, all these things are continually up for auction to the highest bidder, who's allowed to possess them as long as she satisfies two conditions. First, she makes a payment of the amount that she bid every month to a central clearinghouse. And second, she stands ready to surrender the asset to anyone who comes along to outbid her for control. And while this principle is not applied to, say, family heirlooms or pets or things like this, it is actually used for things we would usually consider collective decisions. Things like, will Marketopia, which has long been a member of the market union, decide to exit or remain in a customs union with the rest of the market union? Will it, what routes will buses run along? Where will the parks be located, etc.? Except here, rather than selling things to the single highest bidder, there's going to be a variety of options, and citizens are going to place a bid on each of these options. Whichever option has the highest total bid will win. And the funds that are raised in this way are continually returned to the citizens of Marketopia in an egalitarian fashion as what you might call a social dividend or a universal basic income, as they do in Alaska with the oil revenue, or as public goods as they do in Norway with their oil revenue. So when you first hear of Marketopia, probably your first reaction is that this is the most extreme form of free market you could imagine, something that even Adam Smith couldn't have come up with in a fever dream, because most of the assets that we're used to, this building, most of the spectrum, are not available for some competitive auction at any moment. If you wanted to repurpose them for some new thing, you want to take some TV station and turn it into the basis of some high-speed internet, you have to bargain with the current owner. They'll probably charge you, once they realize you've got something creative to do with it, much above the market price, because they know that they can get away with that. And after years of bargaining, it may well end up that the whole thing collapses, or at least it drags on forever. Whereas in Marketopia, by the very nature of the system, everything is continually up for competitive auctioning. Everything is like this sort of super liquid asset, the way things are in the stock market. So, now that might sound interesting, provocative, but maybe not so desirable, because you might worry that in this world, the wealthy will dominate everyone else. They'll buy up all the assets, they'll control the economy, and you'll end up in sort of a dystopian situation. But then you have to ask yourself, what do you mean by the wealthy, right? Wealthy is the adjective form of wealth. And what is wealth, after all, other than land and businesses and IP, all the things which in Marketopia belong to no private citizen, and all of the value of which is returned in equal shares to every citizen which those citizens can then use to contest for control of the assets. In that sense, Marketopia is actually a far more thoroughgoing implementation of the ideas of common ownership advocated by this 200-year-old guy than any of the communist systems that he actually managed to inspire, which inevitably degenerated into the dictatorship of a small bureaucratic elite that was all the more iron than the capitalist oppressors that they claimed to replace. So that's a paradox, isn't it? I thought we were told that socialism and free markets are opposites, right? That's supposed to be what all of our politics are based around. And yet the notion that to have truly free markets, you actually needed common ownership. And that common ownership is only possible through a decentralized market mechanism was not just a live possibility, but actually a dogma in the field of political economy that gave birth to economics, but also political science and sociology in the late 19th century. And it was a firm belief of many of the people who you probably are familiar with, like Leon Walras and William Stanley Jevons, who founded the marginal revolution that led to contemporary economics. And it was most closely associated with this guy here. So I know some people in this room have read the book, so they're exempted from the following exercise. But can anyone tell me who this guy is?
Henry George.
Yes! Okay, raise your hand if you knew that was Henry George when you saw the picture. A couple of people. How many people recognize the guy on the right here when I put him up? Everyone. Okay, this is a particularly knowledgeable audience. And the guy on the left, I assume everyone noticed as well. But it turns out Henry George actually outsold those guys by a factor of 3. He was the best-selling author in the English language other than the Bible for 30 years. He was actually the namesake of the progressive movement. His book was called Progress and Poverty. And he, I think it's safe to say, was at least for a time, perhaps the most influential social thinker of all time. And yet his ideas are largely forgotten because in the Cold War debate between capitalism and communism, there wasn't much room for a free market socialist. But his ideas weren't entirely forgotten. They actually continued to develop within the field of economics into something called mechanism design. And the field of mechanism design was founded by this guy, William Vickery. And perhaps some of his ideas are familiar to you because the FCC has used them quite heavily. But the original goal that Vickery had was not to sell Spectrum or to price ads on Facebook and Google. The goal was originally to transform society, to eliminate the waste associated with capitalism, and to address inequality and all that sort of stuff. And that vision, unfortunately, because Vickery was a bit of a nebbishy guy, I don't know if anyone here has ever met him, he sort of mumbled and he never really presented his work. He didn't publish most of the things that he did. In fact, how many people here have heard of Rawls's idea of the veil of ignorance? Most people. So Vickery actually published that in 1945 in an Econometrica paper that has 250 citations. So Vickery was not much of a salesman, but when he won the Nobel Prize, he thought finally the moment had come for him to tell the world about the transformative power of mechanism design, and then he died 2 days later. And the goal of this book is to revive that agenda and to offer it as a solution to what I think is the crisis of our time, the crisis of rising inequality, the political conflicts that and the low productivity that we have is causing. And to do that, we develop this broad political vision into 5 concrete policy proposals. First, we argue for something we call the common ownership self-assessed tax, which I think will be a primary topic of conversation today, which is a regime under which the possessors of any significant asset would self-assess the value of that asset, pay a tax, let's say 7% a year on the value of that asset, but have to stand ready to sell the asset to any comer who's willing to pay that price. If applied to all assets in the economy, our latest calculation is this could do something like increase GDP by 40%, And at the same time, even if you ignore that, just think about distributive effects. This would raise enough revenue to eliminate all other taxes on capital, pay down most of the national debt, and still pay a $24,000 social dividend to every family of four in the United States, increasing their incomes by about 3 times what they'd risen since the 1970s. The second proposal is an alternative to the ways that we vote that creates a market mechanism for collective decision-making, under which every citizen, especially members of minorities, would be able to defend their own interests rather than relying on judges or political elites to defend them, by being allocated a equal budget of voting credits, voice credits we call them, that they could spend for and against candidates that they, or issues that they support or oppose, but to avoid, say, someone dumping all of their votes on the one thing they care most about and just being an extremist, it would become increasingly expensive to get influence on an issue the more influence you have. So the cost would be quadratic in the number of votes that you got. Third, we argue for a new system of migration, which is borrows a lot from a system they have in Canada, but tries to, rather than have all the benefits of migration just go to migrants or the wealthy people who employ them, so that you get support from sort of capitalists and rich people for migration, but opposition from the working class, instead allow every citizen to sponsor migrants and take some responsibility for their adjustment in exchange for the migrant being allowed to make some payment to clear that market. So that would offer a real economic stake to ordinary citizens and more migration, and will allow for a much higher level of migration. Fourth, we argue that competition policy is critical to the operation of a market economy. You can't have markets without competition any more than you can have a one-party state democracy. But we argue that competition policy hasn't really been tried. What do we mean by that? We argue that about 90% of the market power currently existing in our society is completely ignored by existing antitrust enforcement. First, there are a few investment firms, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, etc., that own about a quarter of the whole corporate economy, and that are 4 of the 5 largest investors in essentially every large company, in American and Delta, in Walgreens and CVS, and therefore have no interest in seeing them compete for consumers or for workers, or perhaps most importantly, in the political process. And we've seen increasing evidence that this is leading to precisely what you would think it would lead to: increased prices, reduced wages, and control by capital over the political process. Second, we argue that existing antitrust policy focuses on the power that firms have over consumers. But anyone who's ever worked a job knows that firms have far more power over the people who they employ than over people who buy their products. And antitrust enforcement just completely ignores this. And there are simple solutions to both of these problems. They could easily be addressed by simple antitrust interventions, but antitrust does not think. Finally, we argue that the data that we produce every day on Facebook and Google are and other places on the internet, Microsoft, are the fuel for the machine learning and artificial intelligence algorithms that everyone is telling us is going to throw us out of a job. So rather than thinking about the coming automation as machines replacing people, we should really think of it as unpaid labor replacing paid labor. And that if we start compensating people for their data, if we create a real market, maybe we can actually have an optimistic future for technology and even get better quality data to fuel that technology. The analogy I always give is that when Thomas Edison invented what became the movie camera, he got a patent on it, but only for a limited use case, which was videotaping people naturalistically and selling that as movies. And he actually had a rhetoric that's very similar to current artificial intelligence. He talked about how the camera was automating acting and how you weren't going to need actors anymore. You were just going to videotape these things and people people would watch that instead, and it was going to, and then under that model, all the rents would have flowed to capital, and you would have gotten some pretty awful movies, because no one would have been able to develop a career as an actor. You wouldn't have had a Screen Actors Guild to protect them. You wouldn't have had credits and so forth. But turns out that to get around Edison's patent, a French filmmaker decided they would compose things and hire people and videotape that, and that was not covered by the patent. And so we got the modern film industry. And I think we're in a very similar situation right now, and what we need is countervailing power from a new sort of labor movement to get fairer terms for these data, and also to help manage our attention, to help deal with these censorship and fake news type issues, etc. Okay, so this is a pretty radical vision. These changes would uproot fundamental social institutions that we're very familiar with. These are not things we want to see done overnight. We have in each of these chapters very incremental steps in each of these, and in fact with Tom we'll be talking about, I think, some about Spectrum, which is, I think, in a technocratic policy area where there's a lot of openness to experimentation on these ideas. In fact, we worked a little bit with John on some of those issues. But we portray this as a broader ideology because we think it's something that the world desperately needs right now. There's rising inequality, there's stagnating economies, there's huge dissatisfaction with our political system and its lack of democracy, and the people who are supplying the vision that goes along with this, people want alternatives, and they're getting it from Steve Bannon. They're getting it from Jeremy Corbyn. And in the absence of action by those relatively disorganized forces, more and more of the power is being captured by a few platforms. And our popular culture is not supplying a lot of tools for us to confront this with. And it seems to me that someone has to play the role of social philosopher, of actually, as Marx and George and Keynes and so forth did, reimagining how we could organize our social life. And there's actually real demand for that out there. There are people that are really waiting for it. There are people like philosopher Kwame, who's my mentor at Princeton, who's got an optimistic vision of how we could try to have both a liberal, diverse society without fixed identities that become too rigid. But he needs tools of how to actually implement that with policies. There's people like Vitalik, who's actually here with us today, who's founder of Ethereum, who is trying to, along with other people in the blockchain community, imagine ways of designing technologies that don't centralize so much power and that allow for greater diversity and openness. There's people like Zanny Minton who's editor of The Economist, who, if you read her manifesto a couple months ago, largely embraced a lot of the rhetoric of the book and many of the policy proposals as well, as a way of having a new radical liberalism that could offer an alternative to the populace. And while politics will always be slower than these other domains, Margaret Vestager, the European Commissioner for Antitrust and likely to be the next head of the European Commission, comes from a party in Denmark, the Radikale Venstre Party, which was founded based on Henry George's principles, and is trying in her own way to use markets as an egalitarian force through competition policy. So I actually think there's a huge demand for this type of imagination, and perhaps that's the reason why over the last months we've just seen a huge outpouring of interest in these ideas. There have been all sorts of startups and projects and investments by large companies in these types of ideas. There's now about a dozen affinity groups with something like 30 members each around the world that are doing things like this. I've probably given 100 talks on this over the last 6 months. There are artists doing science fiction anthologies around this. There's virtual reality simulators. There's just this huge outpouring of everything from scholarship to art to activism. We're working with half a dozen governments on things like this. So to help coordinate all of this, we're putting together a conference called Radical Exchange that will be in Detroit in March, and bring together about 500 people from these different communities. And the leadership of the organization represents the diversity of the community we've built around this. We've got 4 tracks: ideas and research, entrepreneurship and technology, arts and communication, and activism and government, because we don't believe that you implement fundamental social changes like this from the top down. You experiment, and the ideas diffuse, and they affect people's notions of legitimacy. And so all of these different aspects need to coordinate with each other. And so like within ideas and research, I'm an economist by training, but actually leading ideas and research is Ananya Chakravarti, who's a post-colonial historian at Georgetown, an incredibly brilliant person, but we've got comparative literature people, sociologists, philosophers working with it. And within entrepreneurship and technology, it's led by Mimi Reingold, who actually ran one of the largest blockchain conferences, the main one for the Ethereum community, DevCon. We have a wonderful artist, Jen Marone, who does this really cool stuff on data slavery, and sort of incorporated herself and sold off a bunch of her data on eBay and at different art places to sort of represent what's going on. And while most of those people maybe come from a more traditional, quote, left background, actually we've gotten a huge outpouring of support from the libertarian community. So actually our activism and government track is led by Mark Lutter, who is a GMU graduate, PhD, and probably the most influential charter city advocate these days. So I hope some of you will be inspired in whatever way fits with your world to think about experimenting with these ideas and the ways in which you might help engage with making a vision for the future that embraces technology, that embraces markets, that embraces openness and diversity, but uses those to address the problems that are facing our society rather than turning back the clock to some vision of the 1950s. And if that interests you, there's actually a group starting up in DC. One of these affinity groups is in DC, led by a woman named Susan Aronson, who's a professor at George Washington. So, thank you.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Glen. So, mine's still on the spiral of death over here, so we'll download that in a minute. Thank you very much to Scott and...
Go ahead, introduce yourself.
Oh, we're out of time to get introduction. We consume that.
Well, let me just quickly, for those of you, many of you know Tom, but he's the, as you see, the H.H. McCauley Endowed Chair in Economics at Clemson. He does research in law and economics, and has also been, he's been at GMU, and he's the chief economist of the FCC. His latest book is The Political Spectrum, The Tumultuous Liberation of Wireless Technology, which is where one thing you learn is that if anybody tells you something in wireless can't be done for technical reasons, they're probably lying. Right?
That's a pretty good rule.
That's from your book.
They should tell you it can't be done for economic reasons, they might be lying too.
That's true. No, that they're just, they don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, technical reasons is always given by lawyers who have no idea what the technology is, but they know what the right policy answer is. So that's what technical reasons are. And it's very handy, by the way. You can use it at home. I use it all the time with my wife. Technical reasons I can't do something.
And my uncle always said to me, if someone asks you and you don't want to go to something, you just say, it's impossible, sorry.
There you go.
It's just impossible.
So that's it. So, and thank you very much to Glen for being provocative, writing a book that certainly, I'd like to say it's the most fun I've had since I was drunk as an undergraduate. My daughters know I was never drunk as an undergraduate, so we can't use that. But I told Glen that I was going to call it an intellectual skunkworks, this book he's written with Eric Posner, and there's so much going on. It comes at you fast and furious. If you make a margin note that says wrong, they didn't think about this, well, hang with them for another 2 pages. They'll probably come back to it, and then you have to say, well, it's still wrong, but, or, hey, they fixed it. So it's quite something. And in fact, he doesn't want to be gratuitous, but here it is. Go ahead and buy the book and have an experience. I'll give this marketing pitch for him. And a few of the things that I want to just point out. I mean, this, Chapter 2, I do vaguely remember as an undergraduate talking about multiple votes. We got to vote buying later, and I think you crossed over and went back on vote buying. I think you're on both sides of that, but there's a lot of interesting stuff that does make you think. The immigration, selling the immigration slots and distributing the sort of the property rights to that was quite interesting and imaginative. Now this is just, I like the alliteration on this, fetishistic attachments to a private vehicle, and I've never had a fetishistic attachment to a private vehicle, but I'm thinking about getting one now that I see it in print. Did I hear Tesla? No, anyway, so I do have a daughter who talks about Teslas a lot. Anyway, obsessions with material attachments. I really take quite a different view on property rights, and maybe I'm influenced by Richard Pipes and others that talk about exactly the reverse treatment of this, maybe not exactly, but really another way. Private property is a wonderful institution through history. It's developed through thousands of years. You can see it in the animal kingdom. You can see it in human society. I think that there are a lot of positive aspects of it that really do have public good elements. And certainly there's recognition. There's a lot of recognition of diverse and subtle thoughts in the book, and here's another example. So yes, for all their limitations, markets have been the engines of spectacular success. It's nice to see victory reprised and so faithfully and eloquently. And I did meet on many occasions. I did a year at Columbia University Business School, and he went to all the seminars. This was in the early 90s, and he did mumble a lot, and you did know what he was going to say in the Q&A, and he would say something, and he would talk about pricing. And so he certainly lived up to your description and his reputation, and it was richly deserved when he did win the Nobel Prize, tragically dying just a few days later. And yes, this book does let the imaginations run wild, and we certainly, as academics and thinkers and policy activists, can appreciate the experiments that are ongoing, whether they be Ethereum, which is in the marketplace and being tested every day, every second, with financial markets. But these experiments that are going will make the difference, and putting them on the table, that makes a difference as well. But it is, as you say, not top down. So the theme of the book, and then I will talk about, and I will try to give you some diversity of viewpoint on this endemic market failure theme. And here's one of the citations from the book. Market power is fundamental to our view of the economy, and market power simultaneously retards productivity and depresses employment. I think this is actually a rather Pigouvian way of thinking about it. By that I mean that there's some sort of standard optimization that should take place. It's also been called the Nirvana Fallacy. There really is only a choice between alternatives, realistic, practical, real-world alternatives. And of course, that's where really the experimentation comes, between actual market situations. And to have a categorical condemnation, really, it goes the other way. I mean, first of all, this market power that we see, and we do see a lot of it, I agree completely. But the market power, whether it be Microsoft or Google or Netflix or Apple and so forth and so on, that is what's driving the economic machine. And certainly I take a very Schumpeterian view that this is where the innovation kicks in. And so market power is not the problem, and as a general rule, and a perfect competition, the absence of market power by definition, is not the solution. And certainly Deirdre McCloskey and other economic historians have a very strong time series take on this, that really, when the market power and the property rights kick in, that's when you get the 30x improvement. That's real market to real market. You get that through these capitalist property rights. And of course, she talks about trade-tested betterment. So experimenting with ideas in the marketplace, those that win have some efficiency properties that are discovered, not imposed. So I will talk more about wireless, but just this idea that commoditization and perfect competition are ideals, I really categorically reject that. Commoditization is, in whether it be Google ad sales or any other auction process that appears to drain out all the inefficiencies and can be tested even in laboratory experiments to do that, and the laboratory experiments are certainly very valuable to testing mechanism design. that does not mean that they are superior categorically to some other kinds of contracts that are developed and discovered as efficient in the marketplace, including wireless. And so this is one of the ideas that I think is important. Now, I really do want to talk about wireless because the book does use it as a paradigmatic example for radio spectrum property rights, and of course it's of interest to some of us who spent our lives on it. But it's really a great example of how property rights can be formed, can be cartelized and misused and misdefined, and then be opened up, and in fact just produce pretty amazing new stuff. And so this is the case that, in fact, and Eric says it here, Glen says it here, that we
Actually, my first name is Eric, so that was correct.
Is that what he is? I didn't know that. So you had to take that
I just
out.
did that. I just did that because otherwise it was too redundant with Eric. I changed my whole name.
Yeah, that's funny. So anyway, so this idea that television, yes, there is a holdup problem in television. It is not property rights. It is not transaction costs between private players enjoying the right. Okay, this is regulatory lock-in, and it's about time to get away from it. So anyway, this is not directly from the book, as you can see, but related work, and we need a new kind of license and so forth. I'll quickly go through this. This is all in the book. Talking about the holdup by licensees, and it says also that secondary markets in spectrum don't work, and we really need to have much more active mechanism designed by regulators to get us past this. And of course, the real estate, intellectual property, other kinds of stuff is going on here that I won't do justice to, so I'll stick to spectrum right now. What's blocking the current transition to advanced wireless technology? Well, that's also lock-in, and huge swaths of spectrum not held by broadcast stations with low viewership could be put to better use for wireless internet. Well, that's absolutely correct. But the lock-in and the way we're going on specifically the 3.5 gigahertz allocation is I have a much different take. Okay, so I think it's right here. Yes, we do have holdup, and
is that Rick Kaplan?
Sorry, you said Rick Kaplan. That's good. You could have gone some other ways with that. Yeah, so yeah, that's good too because you only have one enemy now. So yeah,
That's what my boss wants.
that's right. So yeah, so there is a holdup. But where is it? Well, it's the 1927 Radio Act, and in fact, the first sentence of the Radio Act said there can be no private property and no vested rights or claims in radio spectrum. And there was a cartelization, and there was a rent-seeking coalition. The broadcasters and regulators got together and did it. And since then, the standard has been to specify all the uses and technologies and business models in the license, not to have, in fact, spectrum licenses or spectrum rights, but to have broadcasting or wireless licenses that are very specifically defined. Of course, everybody comments, including the regulators, on the long delays in putting out new rights, how this suppresses entry and innovation. And the premise for the whole system has been that there's been endemic market failure. Now, this is, in some way I can't blame Glen for that, but in some ways it mirrors the current arguments. As the United States Supreme Court once said, without the government planning and administering these rights and making sure everything works together, there'd be a cacophony of competing voices. And yes, the Supreme Court misspelled cacophony. I always leave in the misspelling. And as I say in the book, it's not the only error in the proposition. Anyway, so that's what we've had since 1928. This is a beautiful diagram. It was done by hand by the first regulators that locked in by color what could be done with radio spectrum. And so that's not a reallocation that's allowed to the market. That is tied up in old rules. So of course, Ronald Coase questions this many years ago, and he comes up with a property rights proposal. And he doesn't immediately say that property rights to frequencies decentralized in the market can do a better job. He says we ought to try it. We ought to see if it really passes the cost-benefit test. When real transaction costs come to play. And he said, I didn't think it would be insurmountable. I was speculating, but one thing I knew is that the existing system was highly imperfect. Now, you may, in your book, you may be going with some similar intuition on a lot of your proposals as well. Maybe the new stuff won't work so well, let's test it, but maybe we can do a lot better. Anyway, so I think that this is apples to apples. You got to compare something to something, not just theory. So of course, when he gives his theory about property rights, he goes to the FCC and they say, "Tell us, Professor Coase, are you joking? Are you spoofing us?" And he wasn't. By the way, here's a little tip. Abel Lerner, who you take as an intellectual error, you should. I mean, you know, this is market socialism, the Bible of market socialism, the Economics of Control, 1944, right? So how many have read it? Anyway, there's Abel Lerner. And he gave the idea to a law student at the University of Chicago to sell property rights in radio spectrum. Now, it was a license sale and also a property rights sale. Herzl, we'll get to the difference in just a half a second. And then Coase picks it up from Herzl, a law student. So anyway, so you're right in line with that. You might just
And Lerner also passes to Vickery, so.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So anyway, so here's the way that system works. This is just Mother May I. This is 30 seconds. One of the great inventors of the last century, got wealthy on patents in AM radio, comes up with a better mousetrap, but he's got to go to the regulator for spectrum. He can't buy spectrum in the marketplace. It's not a matter. There he is at Columbia University, where he's a professor for a long time, ended up a major in the United States Army, doing radio in both world wars. But he preferred to call himself Major Howard Armstrong. But at any rate, he does invent FM radio. And he goes to the FCC, takes a few years, finally gets licenses to operate. They get out to 500,000 receivers by World War II, when all civilian production stops. At the end of World War II, that's the 1941 radio that they used for FM radio. At the end of World War II, the FCC, at the behest of television broadcasters, immediately appropriates the entire FM allocation, makes obsolete every one of the 500,000 expensive radio receivers, and the transmitters for that matter. And on literally an FCC theory of sunspots, I'm not making it up, it's absurd as it sounds, and he commits suicide over this. The entire technology is suppressed, and in fact, FM turns out to be superior when it's finally allowed to compete in the 1960s. It takes about 15 years for it to completely surpass AM radio. Now, what happens here, after this horrific series, and there's a whole graveyard of these technologies that are suppressed, not because of private actors not reallocating spectrum, but because of the regulators. By the way, you may not have noticed that radio has 42 to 50 megahertz. Is that there? 42 to 50 megahertz. That was the band that they originally allocated to the FCC for FM radio, 42 to 50. That was uprooted and made obsolete. And you know 88 to 108 is the FM band of modern times. That was done in 1945. 42 to 50. What did the FCC have that was so important, by the way, for 42 and 50 that they had to move it? TV channel 1. Just think about that. TV channel 1 has never been used. Anyway, so this is a disaster of the first order, and it's absolutely emblematic of what happens under these property rights administered by administrative allocation. Now, there's not a lot of really debate about that. I don't think Eric and Glen would say that they want a much they want a more modern system that through Lerner and Herzl and Coase and others we've been doing this. But this is not how it actually happens. It's not FCC auctions. Now, FCC auctions are great. I've long advocated them since before there were FCC auctions. It's a great way to assign licenses by competitive bidding, arm's length transactions. It's wonderful. And I see Evan Quirrell.
I see you.
Who takes credit for the father of FCC auctions. It's always, if Coase were here, he'd just kick you for that. I know. But anyway, so what happens is the real liberalization. That's the tip of the iceberg, the auctions in the initial allocations. What happens is this, and like Edwin Howard Armstrong needed the spectrum for his radio. In 2005, there was another new radio that needed spectrum, and it was an innovative and soon to be iconic. But there was no FCC allocation involved. He didn't, by that point, because of liberalization, because of the ceding of property rights to the market, de facto private property spectrum now existed in the form of licenses for mobile service. Still a very small part of the spectrum, a very specific slice, but open, liberal, delegated rights to the market, to competing players. And yes, there was a reallocation from the existing services to hosting the iPhone. And in fact, Apple was able to buy access to radio spectrum. Indeed, the iconic machine that they were producing, the radio, was so in demand that the carriers bid against each other and paid Apple significant chunks of the equity in their companies. First AT&T and then others after that. The rest is, in fact, history. This is how this gets to the market without a holdup, without a 30-year delay, without incumbent interests being able to lobby against it and block it. And that flexibility, in fact, as per the regulators, who described this pretty much the way I just did, you go to the National Broadband Plan, the FCC issues in 2010, it says, yeah, this is where the mobile data tsunami came from, flexible property rights. Now, 5G wasn't in 2010, but yeah, this is what happens. You get reallocation of the spectrum from 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G. This is not mandated by the state anymore. It's ceded to the marketplace. So this is where the ecosystems come in. And then finally, this is a few years ago, you notice that only a very small percentage of private property exists in the market, but that private property is extremely productive. And that's what you get. You get all kinds of innovation because there's no mother may I. And in fact, all of these services interfere with each other. This is a cacophony of competing voices, only it's not cacophony. In fact, it's completely managed by the networks, by competitors, by their vendors, by the pricing system, by the fact that there are de facto private rights, in your cat videos. So everything comes over. They all compete with each other for precious spectrum. Yes, there's endemic interference everywhere, and it's handled by the market. Now, the idea that
Everything's going on. Let me check out this computer.
go to sleep.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
No, I
So-
think you were looking at it.
Oh, no, no, it's,
So,
just leave these.
okay, so.
No, but he's, okay, come on. Sorry, no, I'm working.
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay. So the assertion is that economic fruit poses results never hold except in the unusual case of buyer and seller both. Well, it's a special case. Well, no, economics proves that it's something against something else. These are experiments, and you have to observe where the transaction costs all the way around. The fact is that the administrative allocation system was a very expensive system transactionally to actually produce consumer welfare and to manage the interference in a pro-consumer way. The idea that auctions can be arranged and can reallocate the spectrum is also expensive. It has costs. It needs to be compared to what the alternative uses are and how markets work. The idea that markets have failed to reallocate spectrum, I just categorically reject. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with it, the fact that we have 4 national networks in the United States and we have about 70,000 licenses. This is the FCC count that I got in April. I think it's an undercount. I don't think the FCC knows how many licenses it has. But this is a minimum. This was on the FCC website. So I'll give them credit for at least having a system we can look at. Anyway, this is what the FCC head count was. And this has been all aggregated by secondary market transactions, okay? You could say the correct number is 4. That's what the market is, and in terms of national networks. And this has all been aggregated into efficient bundles relative to the alternative, relative to the fragmentation and the high-cost situation of getting the actual mobile networks done. So you get efficient aggregation. You also get vertical integration. That is to say, you don't get commoditization of the spectrum being traded back and forth. People actually buy services, and that is to say, I don't want spectrum. I want to be able to buy spectrum like this. So yeah, I can go ahead and access the spectrum secondary market right now. Okay, there it is. So I just accessed a secondary market. It's transactionally efficient. Why? They want to make it easy for me to spend my money, and they do. And so there are hundreds of millions of us who do that just within the United States. Thousands of devices, millions of applications. This stuff is completely extraordinary in terms of the allocation system. There is no possible way that the administrative allocation system allows this. And to think that there has been this holdup, yes, there has been. And we know exactly where the holdup has been. That is to say, we started with 81 channels, 486 megahertz allocated to TV in 1953. and it was locked in. We allocated it so inefficiently, by the way, in terms of what got access. We only got 3 national networks, and we got, no question, monopoly profits. We got, a distributional issue. We got all kinds of efficiency problems. And slowly over time, we've been whittling it down. But we have to go through the regulators to do this. And even when they go the auction path, which they've done the last decade or so, we're still in this huge holdup, long delays, and too little spectrum. Right now, we're reserving 35 over-the-air channels for the television allocation table of 1952. By the way, this is just proof that I've been long in favor of auctions. I'm not anti-auctions, totally pro-auctions, more pro-auctions than anybody else. These are my own citations. Self-citations is the sincerest form of flattery. But anyway, this is something I want to take on. This is the boast that it's too complicated. This is not you have plausible deniability perhaps, but you're connected through co-authorship to the paper. Maybe that's the.
I'm going to be pretty critical of that, actually. That's going to be
good.
Rebuttal.
We can agree.
Yeah,
Good.
yeah.
2.7 million interference pairs, and that was the TV station problem, okay? And that's why the government had to do the TV reallocation, this recent reallocation. 2.7 million interference pairs. Are you kidding me? You think that's complexity? There's a better answer, actually, to this. That's phantom. Who would know if there's interference in the 2.7 million interference pairs? If a TV station broadcasts in the forest and it interferes, who would know? Okay, so there's no interference, and this is what the FCC is spending all this computational power on. Okay, that's exactly what happened there. Okay, so 90%, and this has gone back, this is only through 2010 when you have 90% of the country on cable and satellite. And by the way, the last 10% essentially doesn't watch television, but even if they do, they can watch it on cable and satellite. This is a vestigial organ, over-the-air broadcast television. The opportunity cost of going off the air essentially zero. We've known this. My 2001 paper talked about this. And this is what people want for over-the-air television. And we're blocking that allocation because we're doing an auction system that actually locks in the old technology. So the auction scheme on that, the mechanism design is wrong, and the FCC ought to get more to it. They don't need to save I Love Lucy over broadcast television. Okay, we're past that, but we've gotten locked in on this. And the idea that the property rights are the problem, that is not right. The entire landscape in the spectrum universe is driven by a beautiful and complex mosaic of competing rent-seeking, profit-seeking firms. And so this is just not replaceable under a system of government auctions. Okay, now the next frontier you mentioned in your book is 3.5 gigahertz. Scott's apoplectic that I'm running too long, and this is in the weeds. I'll just say this. You do mention 3.5. This is the next 5G allocation. A lot of you are Spectrum folks, so you'll know this. And just to make sure John knows that I'm thinking about him, I'll say this. The U.S. In 2015 decided to allocate a woefully inadequate 150 megahertz. Right, John? You feel badly about that. I'm going to say it's woefully inadequate compared to Europe and other countries. And only 70 megahertz could be allowed to be bid to its highest value use by auction. And only 3-year terms, no expectation of renewal, auctions all the time. This sort of mimics what Glen was talking about, perhaps for property rights to real estate. Tiny little license areas, census tracts. So it'd be over 500,000 license areas because there's seven licenses per market. And no package bidding. This is remarkable. The fragmentation problem you're talking about in real estate. Now you can't build networks. You can't build developments because of the transaction cost is exactly because of this kind of a scheme. There's no package bidding on this. And that is extraordinary. That is extraordinary that there wouldn't be, because that is to create the tragedy of the anti-commons you're talking about curing in other areas. So this extreme fragmentation is an FCC created holdup. And it's a problem. So I'll take that now the FCC has just recently gone the other way on this. They've gone in the right direction, in my opinion. They didn't go down far enough. There's still 3,000 franchise areas. I don't know if there's going to be combination bidding or not. I don't think those rules are out. They're indefinite terms. I think that's better. The point is, if you allow the market to bid these resources at their highest value use, there's no question you'd get indefinite terms, you'd get something resembling private property ownership, you'd have large national networks put together through aggregation. We've seen this already in the marketplace. That's the efficient way to get your services, whether it be your phone or your other devices. And in fact, we are running this experiment. This is where we can engage. There are other countries that do it radically different than the United States. And of course, you like some of the EU regulators? Well, guess what? They're much more, quote unquote, pro-property rights. What do they think the right number is for licenses? 74,000? 3,000? No, they think 1. They got 4 competing licenses in Germany that are coming out. They got 3 or 4 in every country. The United States has, even now, 21,000 licenses, 7 times 3,000, and that's under the new plan that stripped this way back. So, and the United States has very little spectrum that's actually going to be offered for sale. These rights are liberal. They are open to multiple technologies, services, and business models, and that's a great step in the right direction. The whole world has gone that way. And some countries have gotten a lot of spectrum out. Germany is going to do 400 in auctions. Finland's got almost 400, Ireland 350, and so forth. I predict that works better than the United States. We'll see. There's also an unlicensed component I won't get into here. But it's all in the same direction. Property rights will help you solve the anti-commons problem, particularly if the government does the initial assignment with combinatorial bidding, which they should. And certainly auction theorists who you cite have always been in favor of combinatorial bidding across a wide swath. You mentioned it too here, that you'd like to see in the land aggregation some combinatorial bids taken. This actually blocks combinatorial bidding the way the United States has done it. These are the headlines you're getting from Europe. Yeah, Spain, other countries, they get the licenses, they're going to launch, okay, crickets in the United States. Why? We've gone in a much more micromanagement direction, with mechanism design being the fruit that's dangled. It doesn't always work in the direction that the theorists take it if they're not going to look at the transaction costs in a symmetric way, exactly as Coase criticized Pigou. They would criticize the mechanism design that in fact tries to micromanage and commoditize the environment, when in fact the efficient way to get the market structure and the contracts that work for consumers and produce the greatest wealth for society is to allow competition between private property owners. So there's a lot of room for discussion on that, and of course radical markets does suggest focusing on incremental policies and regulatory experiments, and this is what's going on with 3.5. So we'll all be engaging on it one way or another. I look forward to that, and I hope we have some good discussions in the future. I think what happened with TV white spaces from 2002 to present shows us what's going to happen with 3.5. On theory, it was supposed to optimize spectrum sharing. In fact, while the TV bands that were liberalized in licenses for exclusive rights and then sold to the market, they host hundreds of millions of mobile users. In fact, the white spaces, I counted them up when I had my deadline for the book manuscript. 594. That's not that's not thousands. That's not millions. 594 devices, and that's over a 15-year period since the early 2000s. That the whole white space allocation has been in there. There are insufficient property rights for that to work, and so that's the problem. Oops, that's my own self-aggrandizement. Thank you.
There's many things we could talk about. I think the main thing I would say is I don't think we actually disagree on much that I saw. I didn't actually see any. Maybe I missed it, but I didn't actually see any critique of the proposal that we made with Paul. Was there a critique?
Yeah.
What was that?
You need broad property rights like they're doing in Europe, not the U.S., where we have fragmentation.
Back to this book. In Europe, many countries have limited term licenses that are 10, 15-year licenses with no renewal expectation. And this has been a major criticism of the regulatory system in Europe, mostly by European telco CEOs. They can't stand it. They say we need to be more like America. Yet, and so I think the conventional wisdom would say if you have that kind of a system, by the way, they also have more rigid allocations towards technologies that tie their,
I agree.
3G, 4G, all
I
that
agree.
stuff. Put that aside.
Yeah, no, but-
So if you were to take that, at face value, say the conventional wisdom is, okay, well, they can't have more, it's going to be inhibiting investment in Europe because, there's no, it's back to the point of non-perpetual property rights, or property rights that might have some endpoint to them that gets relinquished, by market in some way, rebid in some way. However, there's a much greater density of network construction in Europe than there is in the U.S. There's generally, in a lot of cases, lower prices in some markets. There's depending on how you count, that's always the thing. I don't know that. It's clearly not stopping them from bidding billions of dollars on spectrum for new ones. So I'm just wondering, what you make of that. And because I think the core idea in the paper with Milgram was that, if you distill it down, was that you could have to settle this question of whether property right, you should have a permanent or a time-limited property right in the spectrum, you could have essentially a rebidding, auction mechanism every X years or something.
I mean, I think there's two things that Tom was talking about, and on one of them, not only do I agree with Tom, but I think we go far further than Tom is going, which is this notion of flexibility and not top-down decision. I actually think our primary difference with what I see you as arguing is that I actually think we lead to a far more flexible market-driven thing than do perpetual licenses that put things in a very rigid framework. And by the way, that idea is not mine. That idea is it's straight out of Paul Ross, the founder of alleged perfect competition theory. He says declaring private ownership over land means ending the principle of free competition. Because if you say that it's in large chunks, you end up with the guys who have game farms. And if you put it into small chunks, you get inefficient subsistence agriculture. Only by having competitive bidding, you end up having things like, this is not some wild innovation. This is actually perhaps one of the most classical ideas in all of political economy. And Coase talks about it quite a bit actually in his work as well. So this is really not some like weird, new thing. This is like really one of the most classical.
You don't have to convince me of that. But I am criticizing the actual fragmentation that is imposed by, for example, truncating property rights to 3-year ownership. Now, you say, well, we're just going to keep auctioning. By the way, that's not the reason I'm critical of that is because I see how markets operate and how efficient contracts are written. And you don't see them in the wireless, the spectrum, with spectrum inputs being used. In those markets, you do not see those contracts. You see just the opposite. You do see long-term contracts, and you do have investment. You can't amortize the networks that they're building over 3 years, and that's what their argument is. You have to match the ownership rights with the investment depreciation schedule, and they will. And in fact, that's the key issue.
That's the issue. So let's focus on that.
No, just finish. It's simple. Have a combinatorial bid. I have no doubt that if you had a good combinatorial auction, that the license rights would sequentially be purchased
for long term. That I really disagree with. The reason I disagree with that is there's several reasons. So first of all, the nature of the combinatorial bid changes over time, and when you have a small number of licenses, you get locked into a particular version of that combinatorial thing. And if you really think that combinatorial thing is important at all,
right.
Look, if what you were saying was true, if what you were saying was true, that the market will just take care of it, and then you don't need to worry about the way in which it's sliced up, then combinatorial bidding would be irrelevant.
Yes.
If combinatorial bidding is relevant, then it matters how it's packaged. And if it matters how it's packaged, that may change over time based on uses. So it's just like you cannot have it both ways. Like unless you think that the technology doesn't innovate.
Now, your policy, in my reading, is an antitrust policy.
No, it's antitrust.
Because you're saying
it's
that
not
we're going to get back
in a centralized way. It's completely managed by a market
Well,
process. Anyone can buy it off anyone.
Okay, then I'm misinterpreting what you said in the book and what you said right now. Because if you have, what I'm saying is you have these efficient long-term holdings and aggregation so that networks can be built that are wide area networks, and that last a long time.
Who
And-
says that's sufficient? You're saying that's sufficient. You're declaring that's sufficient. You're the ones who's against
I'm
top-down
observing the
things.
market. I'm observing what happens in the market, what people pay for, what comes in, and
Tom,
what
you're,
comes out.
you're assuming a
There-
certain
there-
use.
there- there's an
You are
experimentation that goes on all
You're
the
assuming
time.
a particular set of uses, and you're just being
I am
just
not.
like the FCC.
I'm absolutely not.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
observing what people pay for, what people build, what the entrepreneurs are able to come in with. When there's an innovator, how that gets to the market, how old uses change and morph into new ones. That is observed in the market, and there's extreme flexibility when you have the competition between.
You just said that if we have fragmented things, that you're not going to be able to, through a market process, just get them back together into those
If
large
you impose
networks.
transaction costs on that, absolutely not. Of course
And you're
not.
imposing transaction
I'm
costs
not.
by having a permanent license that can't be turned over.
That's not a
That's absolutely transaction costs. Look, you have a few guys with all the things. You think they're going to sell that on to the innovative entrants?
How did
And
you
that's-
get 60,000 licenses being traded?
Look, you're the one who said that you can't get the fragmented things together, but then somehow you can get it when there's a few guys controlling all of it. They're going to then just turn it over to the
No, the
next best
FCC
use.
doesn't allow you to buy the fragmented rights. The rights are not in the market. The fragmentation that comes from unlicensed and from prohibitions on sales. And the prohibition is that you can't have contracts that go more than 3 years. So you're imposing the restrictions on the market, and you're saying that somehow that's a
I'm not
market
calling.
restriction.
I'm not calling for 3-year licenses. That's not what I'm saying. I'm calling.
Milgram did call for 3-year licenses.
Not in the article that we wrote.
Yes,
No, it wasn't.
in regulation.
That is
The
not
rules-
what
the
it
rules are
says.
3 years,
That is
Tom.
not what it says.
The rules, in the rules,
That's not what
No, that is not what our article says, Tom. It is not what our article says. You're putting up a straw man. What our article says is a perpetual but depreciating
Yeah.
license, which allows for greater
but
flexibility
you
of
have rules
purchases.
of thumb on how that would be applied.
What?
You have rules of thumb on how it would be applied. In fact, you started with continuous is the best. And you certainly, the Harburger rule would have sort of a continuous
That's what we want.
call option
That is what we want.
to those.
That's
who
what we want. So look.
So
There's a
start.
the actual debate here is
Yeah.
a trade-off between flexibility and investment, and we can have a real debate about that.
Yes, yeah.
But I think it's a total straw man to compare us against something which is further centralized, and we're going further decentralized. So it's just you're like literally like the 75% of what you're talking about was arguing against a system that is further away from the system that we're
Yeah, it's not-
advocating
wait,
than
hold on a
the
second. I
one
want to back up
that's
just a second
advocating.
because it's a little too meta. Explain what you had in that article, and then how it relates to the.
Yeah.
and-
What we want is a system where you create licenses, and they can be fragmented or non-fragmented initially. In fact, I don't think that the way you were talking about package licenses is right, because there's some real problems with that design, and I think there's better ways to do it. But anyways, putting that aside, you somehow auction them off at the beginning, and we can talk about the right way to do that. And then you have a call price that is reported by the current possessor. They pay a tax on that call price, they pay a license fee on that call price, and then anyone can buy them out from that at that call price. That is an extremely flexible system. That creates an extremely liquid secondary market.
Well,
That's what we're
okay.
trying to do. No,
Okay,
it
well-
taxes investments a little bit.
Okay.
It taxes investments a little bit.
And-
I
and- and
agree.
hang on,
And the question is that tax on investment, what rate should that be set at? It's very easy to show that if that tax is very low, you get something that's much better already than having perpetual licenses without taxes, but it imposes almost no cost on the investment. And then exactly what should that optimal tax rate be? We can argue about that. If we start it a little bit low, maybe we can talk, but that's the right debate to be having, is on precisely what that tax rate should be. All this stuff about going back to an FCC managed, just has no relationship to anything
Yes,
that
it does.
I'm advocating or that I think John's advocating.
Yeah.
It's just completely.
Well, because they're
unfair.
different.
I don't wanna debate the 3.5 ban. I'll do that another time.
Okay.
After the recon period is over. or whatever.
Yeah.
But that's not why he's here, but I
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can have a zero tax, okay, so I'm in favor of the zero tax. That is to say, I'm not in favor of the call option, and the property rights do better than having the government set depreciation schedules for the license. So, in the case of the European, where you get the composition, I completely agree with the telcos that want to invest in that market. I agree here with T-Mobile that certainly kicked up a storm when they got these short licenses. They want to invest. They're not the incumbent, two firms. They want to come up. They're growing in market share.
So your position is that the only source of holdout problems that exists, period, you want 0% tax. That means that you literally think that the market has zero holdout or monopoly problems that would work, that could be cured by even an epsilon tax. You even think a 0.5% tax.
Okay.
The imposition that would
I'm
do
glad you stated
on
that
investment.
because you're assuming that the option is that there's no inefficiency by having that kind of regulatory process in the market.
What do you mean a regulatory price? A 0.5% tax with an option to purchase at that price? That's a regulatory top-down
Yes, because those contracts can be created by the market without the mandate. And the fact is that the mandates are a disincentive because the mandates...
You want to talk about what's happening in the market? What do you think is happening in the Ethereum market? What do you think is happening in the real estate? All these people are trying out this precisely because they're worried about these problems. You look at decentralized...
And that's exactly what's happening with private property rights. That is not a government mechanism design issue.
But doesn't
And the government...
real property has to be, you pay, I just like kind of the conflict with DCRA, my property tax, like, you pay...
Sure, but that goes the other way. We already have the tax. Exactly.
So
That goes the other way.
so why should we hold Spectrum or any other kind of asset to a higher
Well, because
standard than we
the
do
point
their
is it's a comparative analysis between whether or not the private property owner feels the opportunity costs enough and has enough of a fluid and non-monopolistic interest in releasing to the type and optimizing, and the real optimization is not releasing it to selling it in the secondary market. The real optimization is investing in complementary assets that take that spectrum and make the most social value out of it. And the idea is that the government somehow is going to force these private sector actors that have transaction cost issues and monopoly optimization opportunities, and it's going to force them through these free call options to get that stuff in the marketplace and turn it around in secondary market sales. That's just not a free option. You said it's a free option. It's not a free option. That takes a lot of that shaves property rights. It has a whole political rent-seeking process associated with it.
There's no seriously. You could run this literally. It is being run on blockchains right now.
Good.
Why don't we run it on
Good.
blockchain? Let's
Good.
turn it up.
So why don't you do it in Spectrum? We can
Yes,
do it in Spectrum.
yes. Let's put that.
We can do it in Spectrum.
There's no need.
But you don't need the government to do the auction. That's the argument that's being made for 3.5. We won't talk about it. But we can do it. All you need is the
Why
liberal.
is the only form of property rights that you
It's
consider
not.
decentralized a
It's
perpetual absence?
That's a straw man. I didn't say that.
That's just saying
no.
listen to any tax.
No, I said here in Spectrum, it's the best alternative given the options. I didn't say it wasn't.
And I'm giving you an alternative option,
Yeah.
which is that exact sort of thing is being used to manage platforms in the private sector.
And it should be.
Look,
It should
why don't we manage the government-based platform just as efficiently as the private sector? Look, you're talking about Google and whatever. They're managing things by continuous auctions of their things. Why don't you tell them that they should give perpetual rights to the search term Macy's and the search term Radical Markets and whatever that will be bid off and perpetually owned by whoever buys that? If that was the efficient allocation the market was doing, why wouldn't it show up in Google? And why don't we have the government run as efficiently as they do and have flexibility in uses?
That's my example, not yours. That's private property rights creating and discovering what the efficient configurations are. This is not the FCC actually imposing restrictions on what contracts.
What do you mean by restrictions?
A 3-year license. That's a contract restriction.
Why is a perpetual license not a contract restriction? That is a restriction. It has to be a
No, it's
perpetual
not.
license.
It can
There's
be
lots of licenses
It can be reconfigured at any moment.
There
In
are
fact,
all sorts of
if you
leases
have
that are not perpetual. They happen all the time.
And you want to block the combination bidding so that their aggregations.
No, I never said I want to block the combination bidding. I think that the particular combinatorial bidding thing that you were talking about, there's a great paper by Levin and Skripich, is completely impractical. But that doesn't mean that I don't want
I've got other papers that show how well it works. So we can do the dueling
Oh, come on.
research on it. No, there have been laboratory experiments.
Under Glen's ideal proposal, there's a depreciation rate and an allowed time for a license, right?
No, there's perpetual licenses.
So is it
Just the depreciation
okay,
rate.
and is it the setting of the depreciation rate?
He wants 0%
There's no-
depreciation.
right.
He thinks, and there's theorems that just say that's clearly.
But what I'm wondering is is it the restrictions that you're talking about come from the politics that would go into setting
fact that there's no reason for it. There's no experiment that's been done that shows that this is some kind of a superior, more efficient configuration of rights that produces something more.
And the experiment that I'm saying is, you trust the market, you trust the things that emerge from it. In fact, you were using before the fact that contracts don't involve that. But in fact, we see in Google the most extreme opposite of this. They auction every instant the right to advertise. Every instant they auction it rather than giving perpetual rights. So that emerged in the marketplace.
And so therefore we should impose that.
No, I'm not saying we impose it. I'm saying we learn from the experience in the private sector.
Yes.
And we use that to make the public sector operate more efficiently.
Okay, exactly.
Rather than giving perpetual licenses, which are that's almost never the way that people who are operating a platform operate.
Except Google has a perpetual license.
Does it matter that the advertisements don't require any capital investment?
Well, that's definitely not true. You want to talk about all the appropriate, there's dozens of papers written about all the things the ways in which, I actually think it's an inefficient market. In fact, I've been talking to Google about reforming their thing to put in more property rights. Because I think it's inefficient, because the market doesn't lead to efficiency all the time. This is just crazy, because there's monopoly power and whatever. So Google is exerting its monopoly power using this, and we're trying to get them to reform to actually give more property rights to the advertisers, because there is a lot of capital investment in building your brand. And then you just get that expropriated by having JCPenney come in and buy Macy's search term. It's ridiculous. But in any case, these are trade-offs that you have to make.
Yes.
And the thing is,
how does that discovery
giving
process
monopoly
work?
power is just good.
Can I ask
That's exactly right.
Can I ask a question, though?
Well, then let me just say that's exactly what you want. You want that discovery process. But that is not there by rewriting the rules and imposing it by mechanism design experts at the FCC. That's done in Google's private, they got long-term property rights to all that stuff, including intellectual property. And so this is exactly what they're doing.
Okay, so can I add a meta question? So from a libertarian point of view, I think maybe part of the hang-up is as soon as you say the word tax, you go into state government, like a government, federal government. And then you have all this political economy attached to having the government, the public sector, involved with setting the tax, if not costless. So I'm wondering, in your view, when you say tax, are you actually talking about like a decentralized fee, like by consensus mechanism?
Sure. I don't
Because
really.
that's a different,
Vitalis, did you want to say something?
it's
Can I just point out that government issued monopolies on spectrum are regulations and are big government and all of that stuff?
Like intellectual property, is that monopoly too?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Okay,
Well,
so, but then is that
well,
the tax?
I do have an entire
and
kind
then
of
what
theory.
property rights are not monopoly? I'm
ultimately,
not trying to be
ultimately
contentious.
all of them are, but the
Okay.
extent to which property rights leads to kind of the kinds of bad consequences that monopolies lead to basically arises from kind of the level of uniqueness and kind of non-commodity.
So does Sprint have a monopoly? Sprint's got the most licenses. Do they have a
It does
monopoly?
not have a monopoly. It's part of an oligopoly.
They're part of an oligopoly? What are their profits? What is their rate of return on the oligopoly?
I don't know. That's a statistics question.
Negative. Okay, so now you've got oligopolists that are making negative profits. Just like in your book, you had airlines that were making oligopoly profits, and they made negative returns for 35 years. I don't understand how you can just say property is monopoly, and then you've got these firms that are competing with the property and not
Is the
making
market value of those guys
competitive.
negative? Is the market cap of those companies negative? What do you call them?
You invest $35 billion and you get $8 billion. That's not a positive
So Tom,
return.
back to the sort of the main, at least one of the main themes of the book. It seems to me that every system of private, and the actual systems, we look at your point about the Adobe and the comparative things actually exist. Every system of private property that I'm aware of, and maybe there's some that I'm not aware of, have some kind of concept of productive use embedded in them, where they essentially, there are some kind of rules by some kind of government authority to ensure that people are kind of using an asset productively. So in Spectrum, we have this notion of construction requirements. You buy a piece of build out, you have to build 70% of the pops. For real estate, you have property tax. There's equivalent things in other types of things. Are you suggesting that there should be nothing like that?
Correct. Well, it depends on the situation. There are useful.
Because it seems to me that
There are useful
applications.
applications, but in this particular situation, in my book,
I
I come out against build-out requirements because I wanted to see other business models like the quote-unquote unlicensed be able to have a chance to, Microsoft, wants more unlicensed spectrum. They should be able to buy the spectrum and use it, nakedly without a network attached to it. So in that situation.
Right, so it just seems to me that their construct is actually a very elegant solution to that problem of how do you have an extremely flexible and non-technologically deterministic notion of ensuring what we would call the productive use of the spectrum.
You still have a burden. You have a burden to prove that that's more efficient than the alternative of giving what are called
Tom, what could we
property
do to
rights
prove that?
to competitors in the
Tom, what
market.
could we do to prove that? What set of things happening in the market would prove to you that that's the case, and why do we have that burden relative to anything else?
You're proposing, this is out of your book, you're proposing incremental changes, and you want to show that they're more
and I want
efficient
experimentation
than the
with it,
alternative.
and I want to
Okay.
try
Well,
to
I endorse that,
experiment with
certainly.
that. But why
In fact,
can't
I have
why can't we experiment
a
with
paper
that
on
in
experimental
spectrum?
economics that I'll give you that you can cite for one of your tax proposals. I don't know if you know it, Abel Wynn's paper, but
Yeah, I know that paper.
Okay,
I
so
know the
good.
paper well, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
so
And it does
There could be
indicate you get a lot
experimentation.
more efficiency.
By the way, there's been several experiments that do show that things like this lead to a lot more efficiency.
Yeah, not in
So-
spectrum, not in spectrum, and so it does make a difference. what
So
we're
how am
talking
I
about.
ever going to learn in spectrum if I'm not allowed to experiment in spectrum? I'm saying we should experiment with
Well,
this.
we are.
pretty
We're
sure
the U.S.
that,
is
like-
going one way and Europe's going another.
I'm pretty sure that like Glen's particular proposal around depreciating licenses with harbor taxes is like very substantially different from both the command and control stuff that the FCC did like more 50 years ago and kind of licenses that expire in a fixed number of years. So I
Well,
don't think
he mentions the incentive auction as though that's the new way for mechanism design, and that is
I
not,
know, that
does
is
not free up all the
I was
spectrum that's available.
extremely, to be frank, I think the incentive auction was a disaster. That's my personal view on it. And I know that's not my co-author's view, but I think the incentive auction was terribly designed. And I actually think it's well, anyway, I have a student who's coming out with a paper about that, but I think it was a real disaster. But in any case,
Because of the broadcaster collusion?
Well, among other things, but yes, that was one of the biggest things. And by the way, I actually agree with you on the thing that this whole combinatorial whatever was bullshit. Like, I actually think what they should have done is just sold off the things in a very simple way and then had liability rules if you interfere with someone. I mean, that's a much better way. That allows the market to be much more flexible. And this whole notion that you have to have some
Pretty
giant
close on that.
computer running stuff,
Yeah.
it's totally, I thought it was totally stupid and a total way of turning it into like a technical issue rather than an issue the public could actually talk about. But, and I think, anyways, I think there was a huge amount of virtual malfeasance in the way that was done. But in any case, like, I do think that, like, just having a more flexible system, I honestly, I don't understand what's so horrible. Like, you have 0.5% license fee and you have taxes on every form of property. I mean, give it a shot, 0.5%. It's like almost an irrelevant thing. Let's see whether it makes the secondary market work a bit better. I mean, it just seems overblown to say that's some horrible imposition on people's rights.
Yeah, well, I just say, yeah, of all the things that we have to experiment with, that'd be not in my top million. But I do, I mean, there's some efficiency elements for Henry George, and God bless you. He was the most popular author, I learned today, for 30 years. Actually, it is in your book, as I recall now. And it's gone nowhere. Nobody likes Henry George.
What?
But
I think
what country has done it? People hate that.
Taiwan, Singapore, Singapore, the most
Singapore?
productive. Yes,
Hong
Singapore,
Kong?
almost all
Hong
the land
Kong?
and the
Well,
by
no,
the way,
I-
look at how the spectrum works
They
in
sell
Singapore
in
as
Hong
well.
Kong, I know they sell the rights. You want to do Henry George here? You want to come to California and talk to the people who voted for Prop 13? I think it's very unpopular. But if you can
You
sell
think
that,
Singapore is like a really unproductive,
No,
like
no,
fucked
it's-
over economy? How about Scandinavia? How
No,
about
no, no.
Norway? How about
well,
how
those are also countries, by the way, with very concentrated stock markets, much more concentrated than U.S. Is that not right? And then you don't think that's
it's
colonization?
a country of 5 million people.
Well,
and
very
pretty much
concentrated
every
stock
and
and they like that. The regulators love it.
if you go to the state of Massachusetts and you look at Massachusetts only companies, you will find that they have much more concentrated
I'm talking-
stock ownership. Look, it's
But
the
are they
size
less
of
efficient?
Massachusetts. It's the size of
Okay.
Massachusetts. Of course, it's got more concentrated ownership.
Anyway, no, I mean,
This must be
I
how
know.
Al Costa when he went to
What's that?
This must be how Coase felt when he went to like the first 20 years of going to conferences. The dumbest idea ever to ever happen.
Well, that's right. I was trying to bring up Coase. You know, you're spoofing us. So, but I certainly admire that. And you put a lot on the table here, and to put it modestly, to put it mildly. So, anyway, good luck, and I hope we have this discussion many times, and I know many people are excited by it. So, it's good to provoke, and you have.
I know that Glen, you have to.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to get to the airport. I have to catch a flight. So yeah.
Well, thank you for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Great.
Do you want to say anything before you?
No, I mean, look, I think that we need to experiment, and I think that a good basis for experimentation is ideas that have sort of like won the Nobel Prize and that are like, and that are being adopted all over the place in the private sector, and that like have 150 years of thought behind them. Like the idea that we might want to like try something like that out, at least in a limited way somewhere, seems to me like not some wild innovation that should be at the 150th place of our thing. Instead, maybe we should give it a shot and see whether like it leads to disastrous underinvestment, or whether maybe it like allows for a little bit more flexible use. That doesn't sound to me wild or crazy. It sounds to me like what sensible policy innovation looks like. So I hope we can give it a shot.
I hope I've convinced you that the TV ban is not stuck in 1952 because of private market transaction costs and too much property. I hope I've convinced you at that one point. This really is an FCC impediment, and you have to give the rights to the market before you can criticize the market.
Based on way things went in the spectrum in the incentive auctions, I mean, I think that was a complete disaster. It was all about private market.
That was the way the regulator chose to do it, but I had a much more radical plan myself. But anyway, I hope I've convinced you of that. If
It seems like
not,
we need to
we'll talk again.
actually bring your two sides together. Your earlier socialist side and your later libertarian side. Or did you go? Is it?
Oh no, absolutely. We've got tons of libertarian. I mean, I would say probably we've got about 1/3 libertarianish people, 1/3 sort of centrist technocrats, and 1/3 sort of socialistic lefty type people. So it's almost perfectly down those things. Honestly, the main determinant of it, not any of these other things, it's basically sort of open-mindedness. Like younger people who don't come from traditional backgrounds, who aren't part of the like policy establishment, this is where we're getting the most adoption. There's almost no correlation with anything about political perspective or anything like that. So I think it's where innovation is happening, and it's where the technology is going, and the notion that the government might think about adopting things like this, or at least trying them, it sounds like a good way for us not to get stuck in the past. But
Good luck.
yeah. Yeah.